What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So last week we created a video which was season 1 episode 1. We created a video where we set up ESXI on a VMware server. We went through the installation process, we went through the setup process, and we did all of that. This video we're going to talk about how to install vCenter server on the ESXI that we set up last week. So let's roll the intro clip. When we come back, we're going to talk all about it. Let's go. Okay, guys, welcome back. So before we get into the vCenter installation setup process, I first want to clear up some things because I knew that when I started learning about VMware, the naming scheme was very confusing to me. So they had like a whole bunch of like different names like vSphere, ESXI, vCenter, and vSphere client. It gets confusing a little bit. So I wanted to kind of clarify that a little bit, kind of talk about what each of those mean. And a lot of the things that I want to talk about kind of revolve around the virtualization part of VMware, right? So of course it gets a lot more complicated when you go outside of that. But a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, the naming scheme that I'm going to talk about, is going to revolve around virtualization, just so we can get a better understanding of it before we get into the installation process. So let's go ahead and start talking about those. Okay, so number 1 on the list is vSphere. vSphere is basically the overall suite of virtualization product that VMware offers. So this includes things like ESXi, vCenter server, and additional components that has to do with virtualization. So a lot of times you will hear a lot of people say vSphere this, or vSphere this, other things. So a lot of things that have to do with virtualization, vSphere is going to be put in front of that. So again, vSphere is the term that VMware use to encompass all of their virtualization software and different components. So that's what vSphere is. 2 on the list is ESXi. That's like it's such a short word, but it's such a hard word to say. Like I always mess that word up. So ESXi is basically the hypervisor software that VMware uses to kind of allow you to take a bare metal server and kind of build a virtualization environment or virtual environment. So it's basically the software that you install on your bare metal server that allows your bare metal server to become a hypervisor, I guess, bare metal hypervisor, I suppose that makes sense. So it's the stuff that we went through last episode. We took the ESXi ISO, we installed it on our bare metal server, and now our bare metal server is an ESXi host, which on top of that we can add and build different environments. We can add different virtual machines. We can do a lot of things on top of that bare metal server. So again, see, I told you it's hard for me to say that word. ESXi is just basically the software that you installed on your bare metal server to allow it to become a type 1 hypervisor. Okay, so number 3 on the list is vCenter server. So just to kind of understand the vCenter server a little bit, I'm going to do a little bit of demonstration. So let's say that in our last video we installed ESXi on one of our server, on our bare metal server, and that became a type 1 hypervisor. Now we have one host, and then if I feel like, you know what, I need another ESXi server in my environment, I installed the ESXi ISO on that other server, and that becomes another type 1 hypervisor. Now I have two two type 1 hypervisors in my environment. So to manage those hypervisors, I will need to log into them individually. So if I want to manage the first one, I have to log into it individually. I want to manage the second one, I have to log into it individually. That's good and all if you're in a lab environment, but if you're in a data center, if you're in a different place where you have a lot more ESXi hosts to manage, then you need something that gives you the ability to log into one GUI interface and be able to see all of your ESXi server, and then you can manage all of them there, and then you can do a lot more than you can do on the when you log into them individually on their GUI, their specific GUI interface. So that's basically what vCenter does. So vCenter basically allows you to manage more than one ESXi host. it gives you this thing called the VMware vSphere client, which after you install the vCenter server appliance, you can log into the VMware vSphere client, and the client is just kind of like a Google interface. And in there, you're going to be able to manage. Well, first you need to add all of your servers. So whatever server, ESXi server that you have in your environment, you need to add it to your vCenter server. And then once you do that, you're going to be able to manage all of them in one pane of glass, so to speak. So basically, I hope that makes sense. That's what vCenter is. So vCenter is basically a central location that allows you to manage more than one ESXi host. But I hope that makes sense, because I needed to clear that up. It's like once you start learning about VMware, it's like all of these things being thrown at you: vCenter, vSphere, VMware client. It's like, what are those? But anyway, I hope this kind of helps a little bit. So now let's get into the process of installing the vCenter, and then we can add our ESXi host that we just installed in our last episode. We can add that ESXi host to our vCenter after we have it fully set up. So let's go ahead and let's kick off the setup process. Okay guys, so we're gonna go ahead and kick off the installation here. So one of the things that you actually do want to do is you want to download the vCenter ISO, the VCSA, and then you want to mount that ISO. Once you mount it, you want to go into the UI. Let me go back here. You want to go into VCSA UI installer. You want to go to Windows, because I'm on a Windows computer, and then you want to go to Windows 32, and then you're going to see the installer.exe. You just want to double click on that, and that's going to kick off the installation. Give it a few here. And there you go. So the installation gets kicked off, and it's going to do its thing. So now we have a couple of things that you can do with the installation. You can upgrade, you can migrate, and you can restore. In our case, we're going to install. So I'm going to go ahead and click install. Here it's basically telling you that, hey, this is a two-stage installation. Stage one, we're going to deploy the VM. So basically what it's going to do, let me bring this guy, let me bring up my ESXi host here so I can better explain things. One sec, almost logged in. Beauty of having multiple screens, I guess. So basically what it's going to do in step one, it's going to deploy the vCenter server on your ESXi host, on this guy right here. And once that's done, stage two, it's going to deploy the services, and it's going to deploy all the other things that are needed on that VM that you've deployed on your ESXi host. So basically that's what it's telling you here. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. I'm going to accept the terms and condition. I'm going to click next. Here it's telling you to enter the IP address for your ESXi host. So the IP address for this guy right here, because this is where the installation is going to happen. And my IP address for that is 10.10.2.2. And you need the username, and then you need the password. Okay, click next. It's going to check and make sure you can get to it. It's going to give you a self-signed warning. Self-signed certificate 1, you're going to say yes, that's fine. And it's going to go on to the next stage. It's going to take some time. And then once it's done, this is the name of the VM that it's going to set up on your ESXi host here. So this is basically what the VM is going to be called. It's going to be called VMware vCenter server. I don't see any issue with that. It seems pretty clean to me. It seems pretty nice, so I'm not going to change it. It's asking you to set a password for that server, so I'm going to go ahead and set that. Okay, and then click next. And now it's telling us like, hey, there are a couple of stuff that you can go off of here, right? So what deployment size do you want? So here it gives you a good description of what the deployment sizes are. So you have tiny, small, medium, large, extra large. So depending on how many hosts you might have on this on the vCenter server, depending on how many VMs you might have set up on that vCenter server, and that's what you need to choose, right? So in my case, I don't think I'm ever going to get past, like, let's say 1,000 VMs. So small or the most, I say medium makes sense for me. I don't ever see myself going past like 1,000. I think the server can hold that much depending on how much resources I have on each VM. So I'm actually going to stick with small, because I don't ever see myself getting past like this amount of servers. And if I do, then it's time to get like a, a new server or something like that. For the size, you can choose either default, or you can choose large, or you can choose default, whichever best suit whatever it is that you're trying to do. I'm gonna go ahead and say large because I have enough space on my ESXi host to be able to support that, so that's perfectly fine. I'm gonna go ahead and click next. And then here, it's going to tell you to select the data store as to where you want to kind of deploy this VM to allocate certain space to the VM to. I already have my I already have my data store set up. It's about 21.8 TB, so that's what I'm going to use. Make sure you've already set this up on your VM. I'm sorry, on your ESXi host before you go through the installation. Because if you don't have it set up, then the vCenter installer is not going to be able to see it. Then you might run into some issues there. So make sure you already have your storage already set up. So I'm going to bring the ESXi host over here for a second. So in my case, as you can see, if I go to storage here, you can have the storage set up. So it is the KTech storage, which is this guy. If I go into it, you can see that I already have it fullest set up. I can browse into it. I can see the VMs that I have and all this other stuff. So make sure you already have this set up, because if you do not have that set up, then you're not going to be able to see it during the installation. For this, you're going to go ahead and click enable thin disk mode. Basically what that is that it's not going to use all of the space at once. So even though we told it that we want to, like, let me go back here for a second. Even though we tell that we want small, which takes about 21 gigs of memory, about 2 TB hard 2 TB hard drive, and then all this other stuff. When you go and then you click on enable thin disk mode, it's not going to use all of that space at once. Basically, it's going to use only what's required or what's needed at the time. And as your need grow and as you start building things on your ESXi host, it's going to increase, and it's going to increase until the size that you set, the max size that you set. So it's a good way to kind of be able to save space and be able to only use the space that's needed instead of using all of the space at once, and all of the space get allocated at once, and that takes up all of your space on your data store. So it's a good feature to enable. Here it said install on a new vSAN cluster containing the target host. We're not doing that right now, so I'm going to leave that blank. Here is the network. So basically, we're going to set up the IP address and all this other network stuff for the VM. So of course, it's static, IPv4, FQDN. This part is really important. So I'm going to talk about this part. I'm going to stop here and actually talk about this part for a while. So I want to stop a little bit to kind of clarify some things here. So when you're going through the installation process, the installer is going to ask you to specify the FQDN for the server, or the FQ that you want to use for the server. And it's also going to ask you to specify the DNS server, the IP address for the DNS server. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you specify an FQDN and you specify a DNS server, the installer is going to try to go to that DNS server and look for that FQDN. If the FQDN is not in the DNS server or is not tied to the IP address that you provided that you want to use for your vCenter server, it's going to fail. So if you do have a DNS server in your environment, and that's the DNS server that you point in the installer to, make sure you have an A record that's set up in your DNS server that has the FQDN that you want to use for your vCenter server. I hope that makes sense. And I'm showing a screenshot here, so it makes a little bit of sense. So if you're going through an installation and you point it to a DNS server, and then the installer tries to go look for, and then you provide an FQDN that you want to use, and then the installer try to go look for that FQDN, and it's not in your DNS, or it's not associated with the IP that you said you want to use for the vCenter server, it's going to fail. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that whatever DNS server you point in the installer to, make sure your ESXi host. So go into your ESXi host and then change the DNS server in there. I did also run into an issue when my DNS server was different on my ESXi host from the DNS server that I'm pointing it to on my installation. that would also cause the installation to fail. So those are two things to keep in mind. One, if you're using an FQDN, make sure that's set up in your DNS server. Two, whatever DNS server you're using for the installation, make sure it's the same DNS server that your ESXI host is pointing to. So basically, as I said, we already have our A record set up. So if you come in here, you look at this guy, this is the A record that I have set up, and this is the FQDN for that basically, and it's .3. So basically now what we want to do is we want to go in here and we can say, okay, just paste that in, because this installer is going to go and then check our DNS server, and it needs to be able to see this in here. And then that IP address needs to reflect what you're going to set in there for it to work. So we're going to say, yep, that's what we want to call it. And then we're going to say IP address is 10.10.2.3, because it's the IP address that we want to use. And then 255.255.255.0. Default gateway is 10.10.2.1. My brain is moving faster than my hands. And then DNS, of course, is the DNS server, which is our main server, the main controller, because we have DNS installed on this guy. So we're going to say 10.10.2.10, because that's the IP address for this guy. So if I was to do CMD slow, it's a little bit slow when you log in directly into it instead of IDP into it. The IP config, you can see that that's the IP address for my DNS server, which is basically just the main controller right here. So that's pretty much it. 80.443 is perfectly fine. We're going to go ahead and click next. All right, it's going to give you a summary of everything that you've done so far. If everything looks good, what you want to do now is you want to just click finish, and it's going to kick off the first stage of the installation. So I'm going to let it run through the first stage, and then once that's done, we're going to come back and then move on to the second stage. So the first stage of the installation is pretty much done. So it's basically telling us that like, hey, this is pretty much done. But if you do want to exit and then continue installation later, you can always go to this website to kind of do that, because this is, again, remember that this is the name that we gave our is the name that we entered during the installation. So it's a name that's in our DNS server. So if we were to navigate to this, for example, ideally we should be able to hit it. But also keep in mind that if you're doing the installation outside of a VM that doesn't communicate with your DNS server, then obviously you're not going to be able to hit this guy. Then you're going to need to hit the IP address. So if this is my domain, the infrastructure domain controller, so obviously it has a DNS server. So ideally it should be able to. So let me actually try pinging that first, actually. Well, now it's gonna get rid of this guy. You can keep that. Gotta get rid of that guy. And let's see if we're able to ping that. So yes, so we're able to ping it. So that means that's able to see it, because again, this is our domain controller and it's pretty much looking at itself for DNS. So if we click enter, ideally you should be able to, so you can see, we can click advanced and it should be able to take us to I'm not going to do that because I want to go through the installation through the installer, but you can see that we're able to kind of click advanced because this certificate is not secure, it's a self-signed certificate. So I'm going to click minimize. We're going to click continue here. To reiterate, this is the FQDN that we entered during the installation, but you're only able to see this on a computer that is able to see your DNS server. So a computer that's using, so if we go in here, for example, it'll make a little bit more sense if I open this guy. Again, this is my infrastructure domain controller. So DNS is installed here and it's looking at itself for DNS. So if we click on here, so you can see it's looking at itself for DNS. So if you have another computer and that computer has this IP address in the DNS server, then they should be able to see that. But if not, they should not be able to see it because, well, they can see the DNS. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and click continue so we can go to stage 2. Go ahead and go to stage 2. So now in stage 2, basically it's telling us that like, hey, this is stage 2 of stage 1. So stage 1, you can see we have a check mark, so that's good to go. I'm going to go ahead and click next. So here it's telling us like, hey, we need a time server. I need to look the vCenter server needs to look at a time server, right? So you can either deactivate that, you can set it to look at your ESXI host. Basically, the ESXI host, you're going to look at that for an NTP server, or you're going to point it to an NTP server. In my case, again, I'm going to point it because this server does have NTP enabled, so I'm going to point it to the domain controller to say, look at the domain controller for as an NTP server. So it's looking at the domain controller for an NTP as an NTP server. And then for SSH, I'm going to deactivate that for now because I don't need that. But in the future, if I do, I can just enable it. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. It's going to check. So one of the things to keep in mind is that it's very important for the installation to be able to see the NTP server, because if it's not, it's going to error out and say that like I can't see it. So if you point it to something that's actually not an NTP server, it's going to error out and then say that it cannot see it. But this is an NTP server. It acts as an NTP server for the domain. So go ahead and let it do its thing. So ideally, we should get past this guy. Give it a few seconds. Let's go through and then check. Still late night, kind of tired. My second walk after work, I tell you. Anyways, it normally take a while. It's nothing to freak out about. Again, as long as it's able to see that server, it should be good to go. But it's not. If it's not able to see that server, then you're in trouble. Okay, so there you go. We got past that. So now it's asking us, hey, do you want to create a new SSO domain, or do you have an SSO domain that you want to join this to? I do not have an SSO domain, so I'm just going to be like, hey, KTech Lab, and you can name this whatever you want. The default, I think, is vSphere.local or something like that. But keeping with the theme of the stuff that the installation that I'm going through, because my domain is called KTech Lab. At least this domain, all the domains are going to be different. So I'm just going to call it KTech Lab Administrator, and then you can enter whatever password you want here. Okay, so I enter the password, and we're going to go ahead and click next. And it's telling us like, hey, do you want to send us some of your information? I'm going to say, no, I do not. You can if you want to. Click next. And it's going to give you all of the information for the stuff like, hey, this is the server, this is your SSO domain, this is the stuff. Again, to reiterate, the DNS stuff is very important. You want to make sure whatever DNS you used during the installation is the same DNS that you have set up in your ESXi server. As I said earlier, I did run into an issue when I was using a DNS server that's different from what was on my ESXi host. And I ran into an issue because of that. The installation kept on failing. So kind of had to read up on that to kind of understand the whole concept there. So make sure whatever DNS server that you're using, your ESXi host is using the same DNS server. And also this computer or whatever it is that you doing the installation on is able to see that DNS server. So I'm going to click finish. It's going to ask you if you want to kick off the installation. You're going to click OK. Basically what it's telling you is that if you kick off the installation, there's no way to stop it, not unless it failed, or it's completely done, or it error out or something like that. But once you start it, you can stop it. Click OK, and it's going to kick off stage 2. So we're going to let stage 2 run, and then we're going to come back and check it out once it's done. Okay, so the installation is pretty much done. So it's basically telling us that like, hey, you can visit this website to be able to log into your vCenter portal. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and ideally that should take us to our vCenter. Okay, looking nice. I'm going to click advance, and we're going to click proceed. It's giving us that error because the certificate is not secure. I want to click on launch vSphere client. And ideally you should ask, okay, looking good. Let's go ahead and try to log in. Okay, let's try to see. Just keep in mind that you're gonna need the FQDN. So whatever your username was plus the FQDN, or I mean the domain, sorry. Whatever your username was plus the domain. So this is a single sign-on domain that you set up. So plus the domain and then the password for that, and then click login. And ideally that should log you into the console. So Hey, look at that. We finally got vCenter installed. Okay, yeah, look nice. It looks pretty clean. As you can see, it's a lot more different from the ESXi client. The vSphere client is a lot more nicer. You have different components. I haven't added any ESXi host yet, but this is what it looks like. So it has like vcenter.ktoechlab.com. This is the name that we gave it. So that's perfect. That's the name that we needed to have. If you want to change that, it'll probably just make changes to the DNS server, and it will probably be able to pick that up, and then that can be renamed. Or I think you might have to go to the management console to rename it. But you can see this is the different configuration here. VMs, we don't have anything yet because we haven't added any sort of like any ESXi host to it. So it's for comparison, I'm going to bring over my ESXi host, my standalone host, and let's see how that looks like in comparison to this guy. Before we go ahead and add our ESXi host to the vCenter server. So let's let it load. So this is what the vCenter, the vSphere client stuff looks like. Again, it looks pretty clean, looks pretty nice. There's a lot more you can add to it, like new folder. Click here, click on that. Again, nothing is added to it yet. So you're not able to see any of that. If you right click here, it's telling you like, hey, do you want to create a new data center? Again, new data center. You can create a new data center. So we can go ahead, actually, let's go ahead and create a new data center. We're going to call it it's called KTech Labs. I want to call it KTech Labs, and I'm going to click OK. And that's the new data center that we just created. And in that data center, we're going to have different ESXi hosts. So this is what it looks like. And I just, for comparison, this is what the ESXi host client look like. So you can see there's a couple of things that you cannot do here that you will be able to do on the vCenter client. It's always got to come back and look at the vSphere. VMware has so many names for different things, but yeah. So this is what the ESXi hosts look like. And again, if you just, in my opinion, if you just like home lab, you're trying to do something that just involves setting up a couple of servers, this might do just fine for you. But again, I intend to learn like a bunch of different components to VMware, and it made sense for me to get this set up. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add ESXi host. So we right click, and then we say add host, and then we want the IP address for our ESXi host, which is surprisingly already started in there. 10.10.2.2. Again, this is our ESXi host. This is this guy. I'm going to move that over again, and then we're going to say next. It's going to ask us for the password. We want to type in the password, and this is again the password for the ESXi host. Next, it's going to say certificate not trusted. That's perfectly fine. Click yes for now. Eventually I will end up changing that, but for now that's fine. And I'm going to set up a certificate authority on this domain controller, so eventually most likely we'll end up changing that. It's doing a couple of things too in the background. It gives us kind of a summary of everything. It's like, hey, this is what you're doing. This is a server. This is the ESXi version, virtual machine, and all that stuff. And this is where it's installed. It's perfectly fine. I'm going to click on next. Evaluation license, that's fine for now. I'm going to make some changes to that later. The lockdown mode is pretty interesting. Basically, what it's saying is that, hey, if you set this to strict, normal, depending on what you set it to, then users cannot log into this guy. Every time someone wants to log into this guy, they're going to have to come directly to the vCenter client, or the vSphere client interface. They can't log into this. So depending on what you set here, that's going to dictate what if users can log into your ESXi host. I'm going to say disable, because at some I need to be able to log into my ESXi host. if there's something wrong with my vSphere client. Sorry, it's late night and tired. Click next, and it's gonna give you the VM location. That's perfectly fine. KTech Lab, again, that's the data center that we created. Click next, and it's giving us the summary, and click finish. So now, as you can see, it's pulling in that ESXI host, and yeah, let's give it a couple of seconds. So you can see it pulled in that ESXi host. We have our two VMs that we have in our ESXi host. So if we go back here, for example, we have two VMs. One is our domain controller, and well, if this can load, which is taking forever, I'm gonna bring it back here. But I'm gonna refresh that. We have two VMs. I think it timed out. It's loading again. Bring it back. We have two VMs, right? So we have our domain controller one, and then we have our vCenter server. So it tells us here, it's like, hey, you have two VMs. Monitor, you can check monitor here, configuration, permission, cluster, VMs, hosting cluster. It tells you all about that. Yeah, it tells you the VM, it tells you the data store. It is bring over the data store that we have on that data center, on that ESXi host. You brought them over. So same concept, I can just basically just click on my data store. I should be able to look at different things, see what VMs are installed on this data store, and all the other good stuff here. Host, files, permission, configuration, monitor, and summary for that data store. If we go back to networking, brings over some of the network from that particular VMs and things like that, and we can do configuration. Click on that. KTech Lab, VM network, and it tells us all about network, and you can mess around with things here. So that's pretty much it. So now we kind of have our infrastructure set up the way we wanted to set up, right? We have our lab environment, we have our ESXi host, we have our vCenter server set up. Everything is starting to look good. Next up, we're probably going to start talking about what are some of the things that we want to start building to kick things off. I'm pretty excited about that. But for now, that's pretty much all there is. We're one step closer to start building stuff and start learning some new stuff. I'm pretty excited. As I say, it's a good opportunity for me myself to learn a lot of new things and grow by doing a lot more hands-on. So yeah. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. As I said, this series is a pretty exciting series for me because partly it's a bit of a selfish series for me to kind of like do a lot of things, touch a lot of things, and become better at what I do every day. So it's a pretty exciting series, and I'm happy to share with other people. Hopefully it can make other people better, and people can follow my journey and then kind of follow along so we can all get better together. So subscribe, thumbs up, ask me a question. If I do know it, I will answer it. If I don't know it, I will do the research to try to answer it for you guys. That will make me better as well by doing that research. So thumbs up, subscribe. I will see you guys in the next one. As always, do not forget to stay geeking. Peace.